want to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is David Steinmetz. I am a senior software developer at Rackspace Technology based in San Antonio, Texas. I'm by no means a performance expert, but I'm somebody who complains loud enough to my coworkers that we're not being mindful of performance, so much so that they get to hear me yell about things when I don't like how long things take to load. From that perspective, if anyone wants to reach out, you can hit me up on Twitter at David Steinmetz, or on Drupal.org or Slack, I'm at Widgets Burritos. And again, if you want to follow along the slides, please do. I also might recommend double-clicking the presentation so it's bigger. There's going to be some things that are going to be a little small on the screen, so please double-click it. I think it will help you follow along a little better. All right, so I want to start by asking you a question. Why is a website's load time important? Well, in 2017, Akamai released what they call their State of Online Retail report, and they released some pretty important findings. One of those is a 100 millisecond delay in website load times can hurt your conversion rates by 7%. So that could be a lot of money. A 2-second delay in web page load time can increase bounce rates by 103%. And if you're unfamiliar with the bounce rate, the definition of a bounce rate is the percentage of users who will navigate away from your site after only viewing one page or without interacting with an element on your page. And so if that means that people are just leaving your content or leaving your page as soon as they get there. Additionally, 53% of mobile site visitors will leave a page that takes longer than 3 seconds to load. So we wanted to ask the question, well, hey, you know, Akamai's in the business of performance. They make money selling performance. Was that real data, or was it hypothetical, or was it real? Well, if you see on the screen, this is some real user data from Rackspace.com in our Google Analytics from the years 2017 and 2018. And what you see here is there's two line charts. The line chart on the top is our page load time, and the line chart on the bottom is our bounce rate. And what you'll see is they are, while not perfectly parallel, they are nearly parallel. Specifically, if you look at the end of 2017 here, we have this kind of spike in page load time, and we have that exact comparable spike in our bounce rate. And as the page load times went up, so did our bounce rate. And as our page load times went down, so did our bounce rate as well. And so while we can't say 100% certainty they're absolutely completely correlated, there's some strong evidence to say that suggests that they might be, at least to a certain degree. Now, there's other factors that can impact your bounce rate as well, such as just having bad content on your page. If you don't have good content, people are going to leave. If you have great content on your site, people might be willing to put up with longer load times if they know to expect good content. So it's not the only factor, but it definitely is an important factor in there. And I think we see this in our user data. So let me go ahead and ask another question then. How do you go about measuring page load time? Well, there's a lot of different tools you can use. So there's, first of all, your browser. Depending on what browser you use, you can open the developer tools, and there's a tab in there that says network on it. And if you click the network tab and refresh the page, it will actually list out all the connections that get made on your website as it loads. And what you'll see is it's connections both to your local host or to your website host, but also connections that are getting made to third-party hosts, such as Google Analytics. Maybe you're loading third-party fonts from Google, and the list can go on. There's all kinds of things you can connect to. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. So you can use your browser for that. It provides some very, very good introductory measuring tool, acts as a good measuring tool if you're just getting into network monitoring and performance monitoring. You can also use Google Analytics. So as you saw a couple slides ago, we had some very basic load time information and some very basic bounce rate data from the years 2017 and 2018 because we had Google Analytics installed. We didn't actually set up anything special in Google Analytics. It was just in there out of the box. And so if you have Google Analytics installed on your website, and there's a good probability that a lot of websites out there have it, then you might have some baked in performance monitoring in that tool as well. Additionally, there's Google Page Speed Insights, which this is a tool that Google provides that, as the name suggests, it actually provides some good insights into your site performance, and it will actually grade you both desktop and mobile. It will give you a score from 0 to 100, 0 being awful, 100 being great. Most likely your number is going to fall somewhere between those numbers, hopefully on the higher end, but you may get a high end on desktop and a low end on mobile. And it definitely is worth plugging your site into, because you get to see a lot of recommendations on what you can do to also make improvements to your website. Additionally, there's a tool called WebPageTest, which we are going to be talking about a bit here. And so we'll get into that in a second. Before we do, I want to also ask the question, well, hey, what about Drupal? Can you use Drupal to monitor performance? Well, if you're able to draw any conclusions from the title of the session, you might be able to figure out that, hey, yeah, Drupal can be used in some capacity, but I'm not quite letting the cat out of the bag quite yet on how you go about doing that. First, let's look at WebPageTest a little bit, and let's look at some of the metrics that WebPageTest provides. So these metrics are basically ways that WebPageTest measure load time. And so there's this first metric, which you'll commonly see referred to as either first byte or time to first byte. Sometimes it's listed as an acronym, TTFB. This measures how long until the very first byte is received by the user's browser after they make the initial connection request. So this measures a lot of things. It will measure your PHP and your MySQL connections and loading that happens in the back end, but it also will measure things like DNS lookup, network connectivity, SSL negotiation. If your website's using HTTPS, it's going to have to go validate the SSL certificate. There's a certain level of time or amount of time that is required for that. All of that gets kind of included in this time to first byte. And it's a very important metric. It definitely measures everything that's happening on the back end of your system. But there's more to performance than just what happens on the back end. There's a lot of stuff that happens on the front end as well. So there's some other metrics that help you measure those kind of things. So starting off, there's one that's called start render or first paint. And this is how long until anything, not just content, but just anything gets rendered on your screen. So an example might be a background color may load, or maybe it is content. Compare this with the first content full paint, and that's how long until content is first rendered on your screen. So most of the time, these two metrics are going to be pretty close to one another. But if you're doing some weird things with JavaScript, you might actually see some separation there. But I tend to use these interchangeably because they're pretty much the same on any sites I ever manage. How does it define first content? That's actually basically if any text gets rendered on the screen, or if an image gets loaded, basically anything that's not just like a background color element is what they would consider content. Additionally, there's a metric called load time. This is kind of the metric that I focus a lot on. It's just a generic metric that's called load time. What this measures is how long from the initial connection request to when the document complete event is triggered. You might know it as DOM ready if you spend some time in the JavaScript world. But this is essentially how long it takes for the server to completely return the entire HTML back to the browser, and the browser do its initial pass at it. And now it may not go fully render everything. There's other things that happen asynchronously after the fact, but this is how long it takes for the initial document object model to get loaded into the browser. Compare that with the fully loaded time, and this is how long until there was a 2-second gap of network inactivity following the document complete event. Now that, to kind of obfuscate that a little bit, imagine you're connecting, you hit the document complete event, then you set a timer for 2 seconds. If during that 2-second window at all, any subsequent request gets made, maybe a feature was lazy loaded, or maybe you're making connections to Google Analytics or some other third party, well, it's going to reset that timer, and it's going to keep doing that until it gets to a period that has 2 seconds of just complete inactivity. And at that 2-second, once you get to that 2-second window that has the inactivity, it's going to measure the very beginning of that time window and consider that to be the fully loaded time. Additionally, WebPageTest has another metric, which is really cool. It's kind of a magic metric I like to refer to, but it's called the speed index. And essentially what this is how long until the content within the browser viewport is fully rendered. So if you compare this with the loaded or the fully loaded metric, which is measuring essentially the full page, this is really what is visible above the fold when a user first loads the page. Now, there's a lot of variability that can go into that. I mean, you may have ask the question, well, what browser size are you talking about? Is it desktop? Is it mobile? Is it a large screen? Is it a small screen? Well, that's where some of the nuance of this metric comes into play. It's also extremely fascinating if you go look at the WebPageTest documentation and where they go explain how they calculate this metric. They do some really, really cool things with it. Definitely recommend you read that doc if you get the chance. Additionally, you can capture and measure DOM elements. So this is essentially the total number of HTML elements that are rendered by your browser once the fully loaded event fires. So this is all of the HTML you see on your page that fires after things like your digital tracking tags fire. Maybe you have some lazy loaded elements, etc. This is the total number of elements, because that also illustrates how much time it's going to need, the browser itself is going to need to go render, or at least how many different items it has to go process and render. So it's another way to measure performance as well. So in addition to metrics, WebPageTest has a couple different views. So they have what they call their first view, and they have their repeat view. So the first view simulates what happens when a person hits your website for the very first time. So it's going to hit your website, hit the URL with completely fresh cookies and cache. Nothing is set. And so it really simulates that first time user behavior. Go compare that with the repeat view now, which will go make a subsequent request on that same URL, but this time it doesn't clear out the cookies, it doesn't clear out the cache, it's simulating a return visitor. And yes, I agree, cookies and cache. I could use both right now. But yeah, so the first view is a first-time visitor, repeat view is someone who comes back to your site and back to your site. And where that really becomes helpful measuring is, is your caching of static resources working and things like that. So there's definitely value in tracking both of these both of these views as you see fit. So let me just show you a quick example from WebPageTest. So I ran WebPageTest on the session page for this session, and when you do that, you get a couple of different scores. You get some letter grades up here. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. What I will show you is you see things like the first byte. The time to first byte was almost 0.4 of a second. Start render is almost 2 seconds. Document complete is 2.7. Fully loaded is 3.25. So you get that. And then if you scroll down further, you get this waterfall view of essentially every connection that was made on your site when you loaded it. And so it kind of truncates it, but you can see at the beginning, it gives you at least a partial host name that you can kind of identify and track things back to where they were coming from. So these first 16 connections are from events.drupal.org, but then you see we load something from Google APIs. We got Google Tag Manager loading in there. We have Google Fonts loading in there, all other kinds of things that are coming in. But as you can see, the more things you load, the further right this Gantt chart really starts to get, and it starts measuring time, and it gets further and further and further until you get to the final load time. And so I'm not going to spend too much time in this tool specifically, because I really want to get into how does Drupal then come into play. So I want to introduce you all to a module called the Performance Budget module. You can maybe see on the screenshot, I know it might be small on your screen, but it's got this nice orange button or block right on their front that says that this project is not covered by Drupal Security Advisory. And the reason for that is it's currently a beta release module. It works for Drupal 8 and 9, but it's still in beta. We're still working out a few, few details, but it's close to stable. It's just got a few more things to get across the line. So it's not currently covered by Drupal security policy, but the goal is to have it covered soon. But the purpose of this module is it actually integrates with WebPageTest to capture performance data. And doing so, it can provide really two key functions. So there's other things it can do, but it has two key functions that we've identified use cases for. One is historical performance trending. So if you remember when we went back and we did that capture on webpagetest.org, we captured one moment in time. We captured what the performance is at the moment we ran that scan. Well, what that doesn't tell me is, well, what was my performance yesterday? What was my performance last week? What was my performance 6 months ago? And so by using Drupal and using Drupal's amazing revision system within entities, we were able to build a system that essentially every day would go capture, or whatever period you set, could go capture performance results from WebPageTest, store it as a separate revision, and we could use it to then generate some trend lines to say, hey, here's what our performance looks like over time. So that's key feature number one. Key feature number two is threshold monitoring. So you may say something like, okay, well, time to first byte, we don't ever want time to first byte to ever be longer than 1 second. Well, if it is longer than 1 second, you can actually set up a notification inside of Drupal to say, hey, send me an email if my time to first byte on today's run took longer than a second to load. And so it's really powerful in that effect because it gives you trend lines over time, but it also can really get you focused on a single point in time as well. So additionally, I will point out this module is built upon another module that we maintain called the Web Page Archive module. So this module was originally built as an archiving tool. So we needed to build a mechanism that would go crawl every website or every page on Rackspace.com and take a screenshot of it. So what we did is we actually built the Web Page Archive module to integrate with Headless Chrome. And it will go and take snapshots of our website every single day. And then we could go back and take a look at that at any given point in time. Well, when we built that tool, we started adding some other features in it. In addition to capturing screenshots, we started capturing HTML. Well, then we realized we had revisions, multiple revisions of the same thing. So we were able to actually compare revisions. So you could actually do visual regression testing directly inside of Drupal within the Web Page Archive module. So that module itself really became kind of this generic, hey, I've got a URL, I need to go do some action on a URL, and then I want to store the results, I maybe want to compare the results, I may want to then go notify on those results. You can do all of that with the base module of Web Page Archive. So it kind of lent itself to be a good framework to build performance budget on top of. Because what we wanted to do is we wanted to go supply a URL for WebPageTest to go act on and go store the results in Drupal, and then we could then go view it later. So we built this capture utility within Web Page Archive, or well, as a separate module, but it works on top of Web Page Archive. So we built this capture utility, but then this project kind of fell off our radar for about 2 years. And what happened with that is just, business priorities change. We shifted our focus into other things. And so this project's kind of sat by the wayside for a while. And then fast forward to August of last year, and we're going through the list of modules we maintain and starting asking questions, okay, what do we need to do to get our modules ready for D9? And we came across performance budget, and I realized that, hey, you know what? We've been capturing performance data for the past 2 years, but I have no idea what it looks like because while we were capturing it, we had no way of visualizing it. So what we ended up doing, it kind of piqued our curiosity, and we ended up building a way to then visualize that data inside the module. So skipping over here, not the waterfall view, this is what this data looked like. So at first glance, it might just look a little chaotic. But I can make it look a little better for you. So just to give you a quick heads up of what's happening, you'll see there's 4 different colored lines on this chart. And again, it might be a little hard to see, but as I do a few things, it should hopefully clarify things. But so this pink line is the average load time. This green line is the fully loaded time. The blue line is the time to first byte. And the orange line is start render. Well, I'm going to turn some of these metrics off. I'm going to turn start render off. I'm going to turn fully loaded off. And I'm going to turn load time off. And I want to focus just on our time to first byte. So time to first byte here, you can see it. Well, first of all, you may notice periodically we have these really, really crazy peaks here. We have a 11 second here, a 12 second here, a 7 second. The thing with performance data is there's so many factors that can impact what might cause a individual day to be slow. You could have network issues. You could be under a DDoS attack. Maybe the web page test tool itself was having issues. It's hard to say what the actual reason for an individual variance to be, but what really becomes powerful is the general trend. And so if the data is trending downward, that means you're doing something right. And so as you can see, it's kind of trending downward. So hopefully we're doing something right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And I want to pinpoint this day right here. And again, I hope you can see this on the screen. Maximize your window if you need to. But this is June 6th of 2018. June 6th of 2018 was a very, very important day for Rackspace.com. That was the day that we actually migrated from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. So what we are seeing here is the impacts of switching from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 was. Well, what changes happened in Drupal 8 versus Drupal 7? Well, we adopted Symfony. We found an incredible, or improved our caching mechanisms incredibly. Yeah, so the caching, we've heard so many sessions about it. There's so many sessions about caching today, but this is a visualization of the impacts of Drupal 8's caching system, essentially. Now, you may ask the question, well, you migrated from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. Did you change the website in any way? Not really. Our goal with that project was really to maintain feature parity. So from our customer's perspective, the website was the same, but from the back end, we just swapped out what was under the hood, and we got all the benefits that came from Drupal 8. Well, we can see here what some of those benefits are. Additionally, you might also ask the question, well, Drupal 7 versus Drupal 8, when you changed your hosting, did you give a whole bunch of resources to a machine? Not really. We essentially did what we felt was necessary to support Drupal 7 or Drupal 8 versus what was necessary to do Drupal 7. And we still got benefits out of it. I'd also like to point out when we were using Drupal 7, we were also using Varnish. When we switched to Drupal 8, we actually took Varnish out of the equation, and the only thing we were using at this point was Drupal's onboard cache and Akamai Edge caching. But even with all of that, you can clearly see the benefits of switching from one system to another, switching from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. So if you're in the process of, hey, do we need to upgrade from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8? Here's some evidence that, hey, it's going to be faster if you set it up right. So that was one example that we found. Let's look at a couple other cool data points that we have. So I'm switching over here to a different window. I'm going to turn these other metrics off again. And again, I'm just going to focus on time to first byte because I think it tells a slightly more compelling story. So if you look right here at the beginning of this chart, you'll see that the time to first byte was very, very spiky. And then all of a sudden here in around late October, it stabilized a bit. And so the question then becomes, what was the cause of all this spikiness and why did it stabilize? Well, remember how I said, it doesn't make sense to look into a single data point when you're talking about performance analysis, but really to look at general trends to make sure you're going in the right direction. Well, what we can see here is there's lots of up and downs, and that was a trend. The fact that it was bouncing around a lot. If you click into any one of these data points, essentially, you can actually go see a detailed report of what happened on that particular day. So if I come down here, we get some overview of some of the individual times. But what I really want to focus on is if you click here on this view detailed report, it takes us into a somewhat anticlimactic page. But you can see some cool stuff here once you expand it. So you'll see here I have 4 sections. The first 2 are for the first view. The second 2 are for the repeat view. But you'll see I have Gantt chart and I have request. If I open request, this is just basically, it's a list of every connection that happens, all the corresponding times that get related to it, when it starts, when it ends. It calculates the total time for that individual connection. Very helpful for identifying some problematic connections. But what's even more helpful is this Gantt chart. What you see here is this is essentially a timeline of all the connections that were being made, very similar to what we saw on webpagetest.org. Now, I'm going to put a disclaimer here. This module has not really we haven't spent a whole lot of time on the accessibility portion of this module. It definitely needs some love and needs some work. So if that's your specialty, please come help me make this better. But I do want to say that this is helpful because when you mouse over things, you can get some information. And so you'll see here that we have this kind of really long initial connection. And in that, there's different colors. There's pink, there's green, there's blue, there's a couple different shades of orange there. But really the longest loading section was this pink section. So if I mouse over that, I actually see that it's the DNS resolution that is taking a while. And in this case, it took 0.8 of a second. If you go look at any of these other data points during this time window, you'll see it fluctuates. Sometimes the DNS resolution took longer than a second to happen. So because of that, we were able to realize that, hey, there was something wrong with our DNS. Well, what was wrong with our DNS? Well, for context, a couple months prior to this, we had actually moved our infrastructure. We underwent a digital transformation. We moved our infrastructure from basically one data center to another. When we did that, our CNAMEs in our DNS kind of got a little funky, and we basically had a CNAME pointing to a CNAME pointing to a CNAME. And so we had all these extra hops that were happening in our DNS lookup. Well, when we realized this, we were able to look at this report and say, hey, something was wrong with our DNS. We took that data, we went back, identified the issue almost immediately. And if you look, while not perfectly flatlining, it definitely, the time to first byte stabilized tremendously here. So it was definitely a quick fix, but we might not have had this visibility had we only been looking at one day of performance data. But we got this insight because we had multiple days of performance data to look at. Additionally, you'll see over here, we have another little peak here. This is actually this year. This is March 10th to March 20th of this year. And what this was, so on Rackspace.com, if you go to our website and in the top right-hand corner, you click the email us link to go submit an email, request a quote, whatever. It currently pops up a modal window that opens a web form that has reCAPTCHA on it. And when you go submit that form, it will then go process and pass it into our Salesforce instance, et cetera. Well, we decided during this time window, we wanted to do an A/B test. No, it's not a COVID spike. It's we were actually doing a separate A/B test. And what this A/B test was what would it be like if we actually, instead of having the form load in a modal, we actually embedded the form directly on the web page itself. So it's just existing on the homepage. Well, if you've ever used CAPTCHA in combination with forms on Drupal, you might know what the problem might be. But if you don't, I'll tell you. If you're using CAPTCHA, page cache stops working. And the reason page cache stops working is because essentially it needs to generate a unique ID on every single page load so that the CAPTCHA mechanism knows that you're dealing with a separate session. It's a requirement for the CAPTCHA to work. And so what we're seeing here is the visual impact, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit. You can still see the peak here. But we can see the visual impact across the board on basically every metric here that we had simply by trying to embed a form directly on our homepage. And it wasn't just our homepage, it was other pages across our site as well. So, if you're doing that, just know that embedding forms, if you're using a CAPTCHA mechanism, you could negatively be impacting performance. Now, there are other ways to solve that issue. You can lazy load the form loading, and these are things that we're kind of exploring and working through now. So there are other solutions to the same problem, but you can definitely see the problem here in this data. Now, I will say we didn't need this report to tell us that we were having problems with our server. Our backends were getting hammered. We knew it. It was just a horrible admin experience. But also, when we were trying to do deployments, whenever we would import config, we had semaphore locks that were happening, and Drush would just hang. And we didn't know what was going on, and we were in this like weird state where we couldn't actually complete deployments because they weren't actually going through. It was just kind of this partial incomplete state, and it was really much a pain. And what we basically identified, we were able to say, okay, we're having these problems. We ran this A/B test. We know there's issues with page cache. We turned that A/B test off, and you'll notice again, the blue line flatlines. And so what we are seeing here is the visual impact of having caching on or off while you're using forms or while you're loading a page, essentially. And so it can definitely have some impact. So again, these are some real user data points. I have a ton of other examples that I'd love to show. I just, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. If you're interested, hit me up later. I can definitely show some other examples that impact other metrics too, not just time to first byte. But what I want to do now is I actually want to go walk you through how you'd go set this up yourself. So if you go into configuration system, I mentioned it's part of Web Page Archive. That's where you'll find this. If you go click on Web Page Archive, what you'll see here is I have a couple of jobs. So I have the 2 jobs that I kind of showed you already, but I'm going to set up a new one. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to click the Add Archive button. And we're just going to call this my test job. First question to ask is, do we want to run this job automatically? Well, the other jobs I have set up to run automatically. They run on a daily basis. This particular case, for this instance, I'm just going to set it up to be manual. If you did set it up to be an automatic job, you can use like a standard content format. So you can use either like @weekly, or you could do like or 05 *** to have it run at 5 a.m. every single day. But for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to set it to no. And I'm going to skip down here to the bottom. You'll see there's this URLs to capture box. So I'm going to go capture Drupal.org. Additionally, there's a couple other features or fields here that I'll point out. Honor robots.txt restrictions. I'm going to put yes. The module can be respectful of people's robot settings. If you're scanning your own property, it's not that important. But if you're scanning somebody else's site, for instance, me scanning Drupal.org, it's important that I'm honoring their robots.txt restrictions. Additionally, there's this data retention field, which can allow you to say, I want to keep the last 30 days worth of data, or I want to keep all the data, or I want to keep the last several number of revisions. You have those options. I'm just going to keep everything for now. And I'm going to click Create New Archive. And so we get this green message. We created the archive. And then if I scroll to the bottom, I now have this other option here to specify what are called the capture utilities. Well, I mentioned we created a capture utility for WebPageTest called the WebPageTest capture utility. So I'm going to go select that, and I'm going to click Add. And when I do that, you see we get to configure it a little bit. So first of all, we get to specify which host name we want to connect to. So this is an important thing that actually kind of snuck up on me just this week as I was preparing for this talk. WebPageTest used to be a publicly available API. Within the last month, I don't know an exact date, but within the last month, they actually changed it and they're not doing that anymore. But they do support you installing your own private instances of WebPageTest. And so because of that, you can actually spin up a WebPageTest server on, they have AMIs for AWS. You can go quickly spin up an instance on an AWS host. You can do it in Docker. There's good documentation on this on the module itself. If you go click on the Getting Started documentation, you'll find some of that. But so because my API key is still valid because like I had a legacy key, I'm going to continue doing my test against webpagetest.org. But just know that if you don't have an existing key, you're going to have to go spin up a separate instance somewhere. Additionally, I can go specify how I want to connect or provide the API credentials if you need it. In this case, we have an optional support for the key module. So if you have the key module installed, you can actually just go select which key you want to use. I did that mainly because I didn't want to accidentally expose an API key during this session. Didn't seem like a good idea. Scrolling down, there's some additional settings, auto-generate historical report settings. I'm going to skip that for now. What I want to focus on is this Kpi groups. So I'm going to clear this out. And you'll see down here, there's a link that says create a new Kpi group. I'm going to go click on it. And I'm going to create this up now, create something. Now, for context, if you're unfamiliar with a KPI, what a KPI is, it's a key performance indicator. Essentially, the way we're using it is these are the metrics that we care about. So if I go create a KPI group that I'm just going to call my KPI group, you'll see here that we can look at averages, we can look at medians, we can look at standard deviation. With the way performance budget's built currently, your really best bet is just to use average. This functionality may come later. It supports it, but it's basically going to give you the same data. But you can do average, and then you can look at either the first view or the repeat view. For this case, I'm going to look at first view, and let's say I care about time to first byte, and I care about start render. And let's say on time to first byte, I want to be notified if it ever takes longer than 1 second. So I'm going to click this, and I'm going to set a maximum value of 1,000 milliseconds, which is 1 second. And so in theory, this will then set up a trigger if time to first byte ever takes longer than a second. I will, down the road, somewhere else, I'll be able to configure, hey, send me an email letting me know. So I go and click save here. And you'll see here, we have their master list of all of our KPI groups. So I have some other ones that I use, but we see the one I just created called my KPI group. So if I go back into KPI groups here and I start typing my KPI group, we have an entity autocomplete field that goes and finds that group. For good measure, I might actually just go find another one. You can specify as many KPI groups as you want on a particular job. But really, I just want to show you that you can do it. We're not going to really focus specifically on what they're measuring right now. Additionally, you have this JSON object. This is the configuration for the line chart functionality. You can go tweak that functionality if you want. It's an advanced use case. I'm not going to spend too much time on it here. But if you wanted to customize the chart functionality for this specific run, you can do that. What I do want to focus on is further down this notification method. And so you see right here, I have notify email select. Well, notification methods are just another plugin, a generic Drupal plugin that we have built into the base web page archive functionality. So technically you could set up and build any sort of plugin notification system you want. You want to notify directly into Slack. You want to set up an SNS message. You could do anything you want there. We use email because it actually allows us to do some cool stuff. But you'll see now that there's two sections. So we want to notify email on either the single capture completion or when there's a performance budget threshold violation. So the first one, if I go click on this, this is essentially just saying, send me an email with whatever today's reports are. I don't care if there was a violation or not, just send me today's results. And if you can see this, I don't know how well you can see on the screen, but we have these really long variable names that you might not want to be managing yourself. Fortunately, you don't have to. If you scroll down to the bottom, we actually generate a list with all these variables that you can just go plug into the template. And the performance budget module, when it sends out the notification, it will go auto replace those variables with the actual metrics from your run. So this first one is what it will get sent when the job is complete running. The second one is the email that could get sent if a violation occurred. And so this specifically is useful if, I want to know time to first byte took longer than 1 second. Well, this HTML template down here has a variable called violations that just prints out the variable. Why did we not use the token API? I don't remember the exact reason. It had something to do with something. To be honest, I can't remember. So it might be something we want to support in the future. But for now, you can use these variables as well. But this is helpful in its own right. But yeah, so yeah, we can do that. Sorry, I was just checking something. So we can do that. Once we get this set up, we go click the Add Capture Utility button here, and then we want to go retrieve the results. So if I go back to the main web page archive list, you see we now have the My Test job job here. If it was an automatic run, we would just wait for it to automatically go run. Well, because this is not, this is a manual job, we have to go manually trigger it. So I go click the drop button, I click the Start Run button, I click the Start Run button again, and it goes and it issues a request against WebPageTest. Well, what happened here is we got this big fat goose egg. We got 0 items captured and 0 bytes received. Well, what exactly is going on here? Well, it's worth noting what actually happens. WebPageTest, it's got to take a little bit of time to go capture the data. It's got to go process the data, go run all the various tests. So your results aren't immediately available. So you have to actually go make a subsequent request against WebPageTest. And so if I go click it again here, you'll see that I actually now have results. Sometimes, well, actually, I might have to run that again because there is a slight glitch where occasionally it doesn't work as I expect. And of course, it happened during my demo. So let's go try that again. And we're going to fetch the results this time. And you'll see this time, okay, I actually got a response. But we see the response is the test started 8 seconds ago. And what that means is, hey, you're being too impatient, slow down, wait for the results to come back. And so essentially you have to keep polling WebPageTest to get the results until they're ready. I've noticed it usually doesn't take any longer than 1 to 2 minutes to get the results back. But you know, it's dependent on different factors, especially if there's other tests in queue. Variety of things could be impacting those results not loading. If I go try again, yeah, we're still having to wait. I'm going to use this opportunity to drink a little bit of water and rehydrate myself. But yeah, so we have to wait for the results from WebPageTest. And let's see, is this enough time or am I still being impatient? There we go. And you'll see here, we now got one item captured, but we can see that the capture size is 1.88 megabytes. That's the rough size of a general data response. Now, it is just storing a JSON object. We could go compress it on our end. We don't, but we could compress it, make it not quite so heavy on our backends, but we don't. But from there, we can see now, if I go view the details, this is the connection that was made against Drupal.org. And then you can see right here, we got our time to first byte. We got our start render time. And then I also added this counts Kpi Group, which measures the number of DOM elements and the total number of requests that were made total. And if I go click the Gantt chart, we again see all the connections being made against Drupal.org. So that's how you see individual runs. If you want to go see cumulative runs and see the line trends, you go into the job, you click view run history, and then you go click view historical report here. And this is actually what goes and generates these trend lines. So this is how you can measure performance over time. So there's that. The other thing I will point out too is if you go to the settings tab here under the web page archive, you can actually set default values. So if you're setting up multiple jobs, you can actually go essentially pre-populate the settings that you're prone to use, so you don't have to re-enter them all the time. I'm not going to spend much time doing that right now, but just know that does exist. And so from that, I do want to, we only have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure I get to this. So you might have a question of, hey, what does the email notification look like? Again, if you can see this on the screen, we actually pipe the email into Slack, and we have it set up whenever there's a performance budget violation. One of our channels in Slack gets notified that says, hey, today your what is this? Your load time, we were expecting it to be 2 seconds, but it was 2.029 seconds, which is above your threshold. So here's your violation for today. It then gives me details of all the other metrics from that connection, and it provides the see more information link that I can then go click, and I can go view more details for that individual run. So this is the module in a nutshell. So I'm going to then go back and ask, who benefits from using this module? Well, so there's the enterprise website maintainers like us, Rackspace Technology. We manage this enterprise website. It's in our best interest that our site is performant. But you might be an e-commerce website maintainer. You might be selling products. Well, you could use this tool to go monitor one of your product pages and just say, hey, and just monitor over time. Because again, if you go back to what we talked about at the beginning, that bounce rate is impacted by page load times. If you have slow loading product pages, you may be leaving some money on the table. Additionally, if you're an agency or a contract developer, you're essentially someone who builds websites for other people. You can set this up to monitor all of your customer websites. It might even provide you a revenue stream to go back into them 6 months later and say, hey, we've been monitoring the performance of your website. We noticed it started to dip. can we help you improve it? So it actually gives you potentially mechanisms to go resell to existing customers that you may not have had otherwise. Additionally, if you're a marketer, you're a sales leader, you're a business owner, you might not care about the technical nitty-gritty of setting all this up, but maybe you want to monitor load times, because if your website is a key channel for your business, if it's responsible for driving leads or driving sales, then it absolutely is an important thing to be monitoring for your business. So just real quick, a couple learning resources. I have some FAQs here. I'm going to skip through most of these. I am going to quickly address the last one. What about accessibility concerns? I mentioned it earlier. We definitely need some help here. Anybody who is an expert in that particular realm, I would love to make this module accessible for people. So please help as you can. There is a Drupal.org issue for that particular thing that can hopefully get fleshed out soon. Additionally, I have some resources here. The slides, I can share those slide links again here in a second, post them in the chat so you can have them. All of this information is available there. So what did you think of this session? Please provide feedback. I gave you a tiny URL. You can also click Bethany Lister's link in the top of the chat up there. Please provide feedback. It helps us. It helps the Drupal Association know that this is content that you're wanting. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and please reach out on Twitter, Slack. If I can't answer your questions now, I can definitely reach back out and answer to you from those other mechanisms. From that perspective, I am going to share the link, and we are at time, so if anybody needs to drop off, please feel free to drop off, but I will stick around to answer a couple more questions. So yes, again, please provide feedback. Mike's provided the link to the performance budget module. Again, slides are available at this link, and please connect with me on Twitter and or on Drupal.org. So thank you again. Mike, did you want to maybe type in a couple of the questions? I think we have we can maybe squeeze in a couple of questions here. Sorry, I don't have time for everyone's question, but please reach out if you have any further ones. Oh, good question. Is it safe to run in production? I would say no. What we actually do is we have a completely separate instance where we run all of our web page archive suite, including performance budget. I think it's better to do that anyway because it's really separate from your website anyway. Plus, you don't want the performance impacts of this impacting your website. There's a lot of different factors. I definitely think it makes a lot of sense to run it in a separate instance. The cool thing about it, though, is you can actually run this against other websites. It doesn't have to be Drupal websites. You can run it against WordPress websites. You can run it against your competitors' websites if you're being mindful of their robots.txt settings. You can do a lot of things with that. It doesn't have to. You don't have to be having customers who are just Drupal to be able to use this for your customers. So, because again, WebPageTest is just a generic tool that goes and makes an HTTP request and then essentially simulates a browser. Yes, yeah, run it out of your own infrastructure. You can do that. Okay, so Mike, let's see. Would this work with a decoupled site? Yes, it would. Now, the way WebPageTest works specifically, like that tool with decoupled sites, I haven't spent a lot of time testing it. But essentially what you're talking about is you have a front end, you have front end load times, and then you have other metrics that measure all the subsequent like front end requests. And that's where some of those metrics really might come into play, because you can take a look at those and just say, how long are these external requests to these API endpoints taking to load? So you can definitely use it for a decoupled site. I haven't really done much with that other than like some very basic examples. But I can't see why you couldn't. As long as WebPageTest supports it, this module should support it. Let's see, is there any way we can provide a base URL? Because generally the live sites run through Cloudflare, CDN, and Varnish, while administration site might not run through the route. So for example, our live site is running on example where our admin is Drupal.example. So you can, if the instance has access to that particular host name. So if you have like these preview host names and these like dev host names blocked by like a VPN or you have to have VPN access or whatever, then you essentially have to run it behind the VPN and make sure the connection can hit that domain. But there's no reason why it couldn't. Now, if it needed to authenticate, it doesn't currently support authentication, but it can definitely hit something as long as the network route is accessible from wherever WebPageTest is running. Is this like an average Gantt chart of multiple requests? So the Gantt charts that we were seeing, they were for individual requests, but that actually does bring up another point. Let me go back over here. If I go back into the overview page, if I scroll to the view historical report, if I scroll to the very bottom after the chart loads, you actually see we have these request summaries. And what this is essentially over the time period that you're monitoring up here, it actually gives you a summary of all the various host names that got connected to over that period of time and how many times it happened. So you'll see this connection only happened in 2017 and 2018, but it happened 153 times and the average load time was 1 second. So this table is helpful for finding some of the worst offenders amongst your requests. So if there's certain domains that are taking a while, like for instance, this was Salesforce Live Agent. That's the live chat feature that we have on our website. For whatever reason, this iteration of it was especially egregious, taking longer than a second. You'll see there's other versions of it that they changed host names for that got a little bit better over time. But that particular instance was a bit long loading. But scrolling down, you can essentially see every single host name that was ever connected to over that period of time. So while it's not a Gantt chart of the averages for the cumulative run, it does give you some insight into the averages of the cumulative run. The Gantt charts specifically currently only work for an individual run, if that makes sense. Might have time for one more. All right, actually, I think that's it. So anybody have any final questions? Anything I didn't get to? Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the Drupal Association having me and putting faith in my ability to present. I appreciate it. All right, thank you all so much. Appreciate it.